You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Marr. Food. Physically, we need it to survive. But food can also sustain and nourish us in other ways. In the Second World War, starving Australian POWs talked and wrote about all the food they wished they could eat. Some created incredible cookbooks full of recipes they had no way of using. On the home front for over 100 years, Australian families have baked biscuits for their loved ones serving overseas and for fundraising. The most famous, of course, are Anzac biscuits.
Well, actually, they're called Anzac Crispies in this situation.
Diane Rutherford is a curator at the War Memorial and resident expert on Anzac biscuits. She's about to bake me a batch from a very old recipe.
This is one of the earliest, or the earliest one I know of, recipe for Anzac biscuits. It's from 1919 and was published in the St Andrews Cookbook in New Zealand.
The history of Anzac biscuits is both long and complicated, as we're about to hear. But this early recipe is quite straightforward.
4 cups of flaked oatmeal, so I've taken that to mean the quick oats that we have. You can use rolled oats, I have done it with that as well. 2 scant cups of flour. I had to Google that one. It means just under a cup, a few mils under a cup of flour.
Just plain flour?
Plain flour. 1 cup of sugar, half a pound of melted butter. That's about just a little bit over 250 mils of melted butter.
So this is a very modern way of melting the butter dye?
Yes, putting it in the microwave for, I don't know, however many seconds until it melts. We'll see how it goes. I've not used this microwave before, so it will be interesting. 2 small teaspoonfuls of baking soda or bicarbonate of soda, 2 tablespoons of treacle or golden syrup, so that's an interesting aspect of this recipe. Treacle was an option. 2 tablespoons of boiling water. So we'll start by...
How do you put it together?
Yeah, the thing about this recipe is, like a lot of historic recipes, it doesn't really have any instructions. There's a lot of assumed knowledge with old cookbooks. So what we'll do is, I've already measured everything out to try and make it a bit easier. So we do the dried ingredients first. Making a bit of a mess.
It wouldn't be cooking if there wasn't a bit of mess.
That's why I got the tablecloth down. So we've got the quick oats in there, so that's 4 cups. The earliest Australian published recipe I've seen so far was from 1920, and it's the same as this recipe but in half quantities. The only difference is there's slightly more boiling water in the Australian recipe, an extra tablespoon or 2 compared to the New Zealand recipe, and they don't have the option for treacle.
Does that mean the New Zealanders invented Anzac biscuits?
I don't know. Possibly. One of the things about Anzac biscuits is that its history is very much intertwined between the 2 countries. The earliest reference at all to Anzac Crispies or Anzac biscuits I've seen of this sort, the oat recipe, was from 1919 in a Melbourne paper. It wasn't a recipe though, it was someone requesting a recipe for a new biscuit that they'd heard about called Anzac Crispy. Now, the earliest published one I have seen, and the thing is I have not seen every cookbook in existence, is this New Zealand recipe. So it was in the 8th edition of the St Andrews Cookbook. One account I've read said it was published around June 1919, so a couple of months after the original request. The earliest Australian published recipe I've seen so far was in a newspaper, and it was from about September 1920. So it looks like there's a lot of back and forth between the 2 countries. If it did originate in New Zealand, it wouldn't surprise me too much because oat biscuits are very much a Scottish heritage, and there's a great Scottish heritage in New Zealand. We have as well, but not to the same extent. One of the things I've done, as well as baking different variations of the oat Anzac biscuit, is just looking at what other oat biscuits were around, particularly during the First World War, and there's so many recipes in Australia and New Zealand. So the Anzac biscuit is really a version of many of those oat biscuits that were doing the rounds.
Okay, so you're about to put the flour in, Di.
So this is a flour and the bicarbonate of soda. I mixed them in together for convenience. We've got a cup of sugar. So I'm using caster sugar. So I'll just mix those up a bit.
Do we know whether what we think of as Anzac biscuits, these oatmeal, golden syrup or treacle, eggless type of biscuits, whether they were sent to the troops in the First World War?
There's a lot of confusion about that. The myth is that they were, and that's how they became known as the Anzac biscuit. This particular recipe, at least publicly as a national cultural institution, doesn't appear to have really developed until the 1920s. I don't for a second doubt that there were women who were sending oatmeal biscuits to the front. Certainly there were biscuits being sent, we know that for a fact. But what I find interesting is that one of the earliest Anzac biscuits named Anzac biscuit is actually the Anzac ginger biscuit, and it's not an oat biscuit at all. It was from 1916. It was published in a newspaper.
But it was called an Anzac biscuit.
It was called the Anzac ginger biscuit. In some ways it's a bit similar to a ginger snap. It's that style of biscuit. So you roll out the dough and you use a cutter. And it's very much the type of biscuit that would transport very well. It's quite hard, it's quite stable. I mean, depending on the recipe you use for Anzac biscuits, they can be a bit crumbly. It really depends on how you make them, how you bake them. I do know that in the Second World War on, they certainly were sent overseas. During the First World War, what we know as Anzac biscuits, as a national cultural thing, wasn't. It developed post-war. And certainly in the 1920s, you have so many different variants. One of the things that I did a few years ago was go through baking. I think it was 5 different versions of the Anzac biscuit. So I did the 1920 version. I baked a version from 1929 which included coconut. I did a version which was flourless. It was a little bit like a brandy snap. I did another one, an Anzac biscuit from, it was either 1927 or 1929, which had a lot of dates and spices, sort of a Middle Eastern feel to it. And there was one other one that I did as well, which was an oat one, which was from 1929.
Some Anzac biscuit recipes specify brown rather than white sugar. Some call for a greater quantity of golden syrup or treacle. Some even use eggs, but most don't.
The lack of egg is an interesting point with the Anzac biscuit. What people tend to forget is that chickens normally, under normal circumstances, don't really lay through winter, or they lay less. So today we're very used to having eggs 365 days a year. Back then, either if you had chickens or if you bought the eggs, there would be a decrease over the winter period. So egg-free baking is actually a fairly common thing to find in old recipe books and newspapers. So whether the Anzac biscuit is a reflection of that, or some of the other stories is that egg wasn't used so it wouldn't spoil, the egg would spoil the biscuit. I don't know if that's true or not. And the other one is because the egg industry was reduced due to shortages of labour. I've not investigated either of those stories, so I don't know whether they're true or not, but as I say, egg-free baking is not unusual during that period.
Okay, well these dry ingredients look beautifully mixed together. What goes in now?
Now the wet ingredients. So I need 2 tablespoons of boiling water, and I'm actually putting that into the golden syrup. Now I'm going to say something potentially controversial here. I've made both versions of this recipe, one version with golden syrup and one version with treacle. Because it's only a small quantity of them in such a large quantity of flour and oats, the flavour isn't all that different, but it is a little bit different, and I have to say I actually prefer the treacle version.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, shocking and controversial. It just has a little bit of it's very slight, but just a little bit more of a, maybe you could call it almost an adult flavour. It's just a little bit stronger, a little bit darker in flavour. Not much, but just enough to make it a little bit more interesting.
I'm definitely going to bow to your experience with making Anzac biscuits.
All right, let me make a little well.
So this is the melted butter going in first?
This is the melted butter. I'm just putting it in first because there's more of it. Oops. Now I think some people might actually put the bicarb. Some put it in with the dry ingredients, and I think some put it in with the boiling water. I don't know if there's a proper way of doing it, but I've put it in, the boiling water in with the syrup just to make it easier to pour out. Some of the other recipes from the period just had all the dry ingredients together, so that's why the bicarb's already in with the flour. I'm just finishing mixing in the flour and the oats into the butter just to get some consistency.
With your hands?
With my hands. It's just easier than doing it with a spatula once you reach this point.
You're releasing that nice buttery smell now too.
Yeah, and I've used butter, not margarine. I prefer butter in baking. Though it's interesting because some of the old biscuit recipes, I had one where you needed lard. And yes, I don't buy lard, so I used butter and it was still all good. So it's interesting just seeing how culture changes, how ingredients changes and that kind of thing. But I mean, the Anzac biscuit certainly is one recipe that's been around. Well, I guess, I mean, if it was first published in 1919, this is the 100th anniversary of it really, isn't it?
It is.
So I hadn't really thought of that, but there it is.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Marr.
All right, so we're all mixed in.
We're going to leave Diane now to shape the little balls of biscuit mix, flatten them slightly and bake them in a moderate oven for about 10 minutes. We'll be back later. While the Anzac biscuits are cooking, I want to catch up with two other curators, Blake Singley and Tracy Langner. They've got something else to share.
When this came across my desk 2 years ago, I had no idea what I was about to open up or the ongoing story that was going to unfold.
It's a tiny recipe book made in Kuching by an Australian prisoner of war called Ron Foster. He was captured by the Japanese after the fall of Singapore in 1942.
It's 2 little tin plates and interleaved are handmade pages. There's about 70 pages. They're back to back with the most tiny, tiny writing covering every single page. And this is what grabbed me because as I started reading the pages, I realised that they were the most exotic recipes. There was cream and cheese and meat and vegetables. But I knew that the prisoners of war under the Japanese were starving. So why would you torture yourself like this, writing a recipe book with the most wonderful ingredients? I then realised that this was actually a survival strategy, and it certainly wasn't unique, that in all of the camps, whether it was Sandakan or Kuching or Japan or Korea or Ambon, Changi, everyone was keeping recipe books. And what is very prevalent is the wealth of ingredients that fill these recipe books.
And Blake, as Tracy says, this is just one of many prisoner of war cookbooks. What are some of the others that you've come across?
One of them is from a nurse who was in Japan. She was captured in Rabaul and then taken across to Japan. We also have one from a POW who was held in Korea in one of the Japanese prisoner of war camps there. The cookbooks themselves reflect the scope of the Japanese prisoner of war camp system that was across Southeast Asia.
Where were the prisoners getting these recipes from?
Several different ways. So one of the things that brought the prisoners together, they had... one thing I will actually note is that with all of the recipe books that the memorial has in its collection, they've all been written by officers. So officers in the POW camp had endless hours, endless days. They weren't allowed to work. So classes, recipes, metalwork, woodwork, all became ways to fill in your time. So the recipe club would be a group of people getting together, sharing recipes, swapping recipes. So if we talk about this little book again, written by Ron Foster, he probably would have got into a group of about 3 or 4 others. Kuching was quite a tightly controlled camp, so you weren't allowed to meet with a group that was larger than 3. You always had to have a deck of cards with you because if the guards came up, you'd put the recipe books away and you would look like you were playing cards. And it was very much about remembering home. It was resilience. It was about getting home one day and cooking from these recipes. They weren't going to let they weren't going to let themselves be squashed. It's really interesting because with Ron Foster, when he first arrived in the POW camp, the Japanese commandant said, this war is going to last for 100 years. We are going to squash you. You're not going to survive. So it was interesting, all the different survival, tactics that they took, and sharing recipes was very much one of them. It was interesting when Blake and I were talking ahead and realising that it wasn't just sharing recipes. Blake, being the expert on cookbooks, realised that they were genuine recipes, that some of them would have had to have been copied from books.
Blake is a former chef who studied Australian cookbooks for his PhD.
Look, in Ron Foster's case, it's interesting because the recipes in this little booklet don't really reflect what people were eating in Australia at the time. It's a very, very international type of recipes in it. There's a recipe for ravioli made from scratch, for example, so the pasta, the filling, the sauce.
So where would he have got the recipe for that?
This is a question that we're still, I guess, investigating. The prisoners in Kuching had access to some books, but it's unlikely that they would have got hold of cookery books. These weren't books that were held in libraries so much. There were things that were held in the kitchen. There were practical books that didn't make their way into libraries in most instances. So we've got a number of theories at play. He was a journalist living in Sydney. Journalists at that time were part of, I guess, more of a bohemian bent. They were interested in food. But the way that these recipes are written, there seems to be indications that he was a gourmet himself, because they're not written like a cookbook recipe was written at the time.
But the other book that we've just been talking about, this one with the little stripy cover that was written by a nurse, very different types of recipes in this one.
And it's interesting too, because this book that's been written by the nurse. It's indexed. Every different type has a chapter. You'll have fish, you'll have meat, you'll have desserts. Whereas with Ron's, it's very much like a daily diary.
Well, it's likely that Eileen Callaghan, having been trained as a nurse, would have undertaken domestic science courses while at school. Most women at that time would have done that at school. And the recipes in her book kind of replicate the recipes that you see in domestic science cookbooks in that period of time. And obviously nurses too, in many instances, were in charge of cooking meals for patients as well. So you can see how she's replicating her lived experience in the pages of the cookbook. With Ron, it's a little bit more vague. We don't have sufficient information to know where he got those recipes from. We've seen in other cookbooks as well where you could see that being copied almost verbatim from a cookery book. Just the way that they've written them, the breadth of recipes that are included in them are clearly written from another source. To me, Ron Foster's book is the most mysterious one, because it's obviously somebody who's very, very interested in food. But I get the impression that he has written those from his own head to some instance, yeah.
Which contrasts greatly with one of the other ones where they had Mrs. Beaton's cookbook. So one of the POWs had brought this with him, and it became the most popular book.
He'd taken it with him to war.
He had. And as you can imagine, needing to find things to fill in the day, reading books became a very, very popular thing to do, and each of the camps established a library. But it was really interesting hearing about Mrs. Beaton's cookery book being the most popular book, and people couldn't wait until it was, their turn to get that cookbook.
Wow. Tracy, you've said that making these cookbooks, writing these books, talking about the recipes was a way of survival. It was a survival strategy for some of the soldiers. What's your theory on it, Blake?
I think the same is, you kind of remember home by writing these things down, the possibility of a meal to come once the war is finished. I think psychologically people kind of cling to food as a way to remember home, to envision a new space. So I think that's part of the process here as well. But it's remarkable, though, the detail that these recipes, they've gone into. They've kind of written down every single detail with absolutely no possibility of them eating those recipes in the camps. Because they've even included Japanese recipes, which I think is fascinating, seeing that they're seen in this instance as the enemy. They're the people who are treating them quite brutally and guiding them, yet they're happy to include Japanese dishes in these recipe books.
When you think about what they were eating in the very early days of being POWs, well, they hadn't been used to cooking rice. They didn't know how to cook well with rice. And so when I first saw Ron's recipe book, I thought, oh, this is going to be instructional about how you cook with rice, how you can make a tasty meal. But no, it wasn't at all.
Which I think it leads to the point that these are a way to escape the condition, because they're not practical recipes for the ingredients they could find, for the wild herbs or wild plants that were around the camp, or how to cook rice, or how to maximise the poor ingredients that they had. So they weren't practical things. They were really aspirational, fantasy.
There's an interesting gender question here too, because in the 1940s, in Australian society, men weren't the cooks in the home by and large.
Well, you had two types of men who cooked in that period of time, really. There were the professional cooks and there were the gourmets. But you're right, in the domestic setting, it was women who did most of the cooking. And interestingly, Eileen Callaghan's recipes reflect that more domestic style cooking.
You have come across, though, Tracy, in your research, a letter that a prisoner of war has written to his wife talking about his cookbook.
Yes, so this is 1942 and his letter is headed the 263rd day of being a POW.
And who was this?
And his name is Alex Johnston, and he was in Jinsen POW camp in Korea. Interestingly, in Korea, the Japanese used those prisoner camps as propaganda camps, so they had a little bit more access to a healthy diet than a lot of the other POW camps. So Alex, on this day, the 5th of November 1942, is writing to his wife and he said, started writing up a recipe book. Everyone else seems to be doing it, so I may as well be in it. I am going to make a good job of it, as it might be handy for you. Oh, yes.
I wonder if he meant that the recipes might be handy for her to cook in the future, or whether he might have tried his hand himself when he got back, if he got back.
Subsequent entries implied that he was relying on her to use the recipe book.
And in his recipes, they clearly copied from a cookery book. You can just tell by the way that they're written down that he's kind of emulated the style of cookbooks at the time. So I get the idea that he really just had a cookbook there, and to pass the time he was copying them down word by word.
In 3 weeks he wrote 450 recipes. So yes, it was very much copying from a book.
A way to keep himself busy.
Definitely.
Is there any evidence that any of the recipes from the books that you have in the War Memorials collection were cooked by the people who wrote them once they did get home?
Most of them, I'm going to say no, because when the POWs were liberated, they were told not to talk about their experiences once they got back home. So most of the recipe books, the diaries, would have been put away in the attic. The book that we started talking about in the beginning, Ron Foster's book, this one is different in that it was used. 30 years later, the Foster family were moving house, and one of their teenage sons, so he was about 14 at the time, he cooked from the cookbook for his father. So
do we know what dishes he made?
Crab pancakes.
In his cookbook, Ron calls this recipe puyong hoi. It's a Chinese-Indonesian dish, also known as egg foo young. According to Ron's son Neil, it was the name of a restaurant Ron visited in Singapore before his capture. And I noticed flipping through Eileen's cookbook, the nurse, that on page 162, because she's carefully numbered all the pages, as you said, this book is indexed, and she has a recipe here for Anzac dainties.
That's correct, Anzac dainties, which is really a recipe for Anzac biscuits. When you look at the recipe, it matches most of the other recipes for Anzac biscuits that were around at the time. And you do wonder what kind of thoughts were going through her head as she's writing down that recipe, whether she was really kind of thinking back to the experiences of other prisoners of war and, the experience of other people in the First World War as well.
What do you think is so special about these recipe books, these cookbooks, Tracy?
I think for me it's the paradox. It's the fact that these prisoners were starving and they were determined that they were going to survive, they were going to be resilient, and they found a way of getting together, of sharing recipes that really instilled them with that hope that they were going to get home and they were going to eat well again and they were going to use these recipe books.
And Blake?
I think for me it's the fact that they weren't just copying down recipes that they were familiar with, that kind of gave them an idea of home, but that they were aspirational, and that they had, recipes from all over the world, from Mexico, from Brazil, from Indonesia and Japan as well, and I find that quite remarkable.
It's time to find out how Diane's Anzac biscuits are going, so I head back to the kitchen. She's just about to take them out of the oven.
All right.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So nice medium sort of brown colour.
Golden brown.
Golden brown, yes, golden brown, exactly. Yeah.
You've got to be happy with these.
Yeah, they're lovely. Actually, they've come up really nicely and quite differently from other times that I've made this particular recipe. It's interesting how it doesn't always turn out the same. The previous ones, I don't know whether I had a little less butter last time or not, but they were a much drier biscuit. These ones have actually been a little bit more of a moist biscuit, so it'll be interesting to see how they turn out once they cool down.
Why do you think Anzac biscuits have become so well loved?
I think part of it's just the culture, the remembrance of people who've gone away to war, but also for the families at home. Baking, trying to make comforts, trying to bring a little bit of home, whether it's Anzac biscuits, whether it's fruit cake, whether it's ginger biscuits. These days people are sending homemade choc chip biscuits. Whatever it is, just bringing that little feeling of home and showing love through baking.
Can I try one?
I'll go for it. Yeah.
Crunch on the outside, a bit chewy on the inside. Absolutely perfect.
Yeah, delicious.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Marr. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.